Welcome to the video for chapter 21 of the Cambridge Introduction to Sanskrit, which is going to tell you about the future tense and about the middle and passive voice. First of all, the future. The meaning of future forms in Sanskrit is just like that of future forms in English, in that they talk about things that will be. I will go, I will see, he will hear, she will run, and so on. Future forms do not use the present tense stem, but rather they combine a verbal root in guna. If you don't quite know how to form guna anymore, go back to chapter 7 on vowel gradation. Then the future marker sya or ishya. And finally, primary endings, i.e. the exact same endings that we also know from the present tense. Let's look at an example of this. What we have here is the future of gam, meaning to go, where the first singular is gamishyami, consisting of gam, the root in guna, ishya, the future suffix, and then our ending, which for the first singular altogether gives us gamishyami. Then we continue to gamishyasi, gamishyati, then in the dual gamishyawach, gamishyatach, gamishyatach, and in the plural gamishyamach, gamishyata, gamishyanti. You may wonder why we have two different suffixes for forming the future, namely sya and ishya. And basically what we have here is exactly the same that we also saw in chapter 8, where we had other suffixes that began with a consonant, in that case t, so ta, twa, and tum, that either appeared as such or had a short I appearing in front of them. So, for example, you could get kur ta, but pat I ta. Here we have the exact same thing happening, a short I appearing in front of the future marker sya. When that happens, then through ruki, the I changes the sya into shya, and that's how we get ishya. If you don't quite remember the ruki rule anymore, go back to chapter 9, where it was introduced. Again, we cannot predict in which verbs this I will appear, and sometimes we even get both formations using sya and ishya of one and the same verb. So, for example, from gam to go, we actually get both gamishyati and gansyati, where in front of the sya, the gam changes through internal sandhi to gan, so gansyati. We can, however, predict the future of one specific kind of verb, namely class 10 verbs and related to those causative verbs. These are formed by adding ishya, only ever ishya, never sya, to the present stem minus the thematic vowel. So, for example, from a class 10 verb such as katayati, he tells, we get the present stem kataya. From that we take away the final a and we add ishya, giving us katayishyati, he will tell. Similarly, from patati, he falls, we get the causative patayati, he causes something to fall, he throws something. From that we get the present stem pataya. From that we then take off the final a, leaving us with patai. To that we add ishya, giving us, for example, patayishyati, he will cause to fall, he will throw. In the alternative future that we just saw for gam, which was gansyati, we saw a little bit of internal sandhi. In front of the s, the gam changed into gan. Now, this is actually a fairly frequent phenomenon, so let's look at the various kinds of internal sandhi that we find before the s of the future marker sya. If a verbal root ends in a stop, this stop will lose both its voice and its aspiration. Furthermore, palatal stops will become velas, and the velar stop that is both unvoiced and unaspirated is k, and so after that k, the s changes into sh due to ruki. So, for example, of yuj, meaning to join, we might expect a future form yuj syati, with yuj being the guna of yuj, and then we add sya, and then we add ti. But in front of the sya, the j at the end of yuj, first of all loses its voice, becoming yuj. ch is a palatal sound, which is then replaced by its corresponding velar form, which is k. And so we have yok, sya, ti. After the k, sya becomes shya due to ruki, and so we get yok, shya, ti. Next, if a root ends in palatal sh, this sh again turns into a velar, and specifically the unvoiced, unaspirated velar stop k. And after this k, we again get the change from s into sh because of ruki. So for example of wish, to enter, we have a third singular future form wake, shyati. Wish in guna would be wesh. In front of the sya, the sh at the end of wesh changes into k, so we get wake. And after this wake, the sya changes into shya, and so we get wake, shya, ti. Of drish, to see, we actually do not get a guna form darsh, but rather it appears as drush, so the guna a appears behind the zero grade vowel r, so drush. Then in front of sya, this sh at the end of drush changes into k, giving us drak. After this drak, the s in sya changes into shya, and so we get drak, shyati. H at the end of verbal roots also changes into k, and thus once again we get s turned into sh due to ruki. So for example of snich, meaning to love, we get the guna snech. In front of sya, snech changes into snake. After this snake, sya changes into shya, and so we get snech shyati, he will love. And finally, and this is fairly rare, if you have a root that ends in an s, this s sometimes changes into a t. And so of was, meaning to dwell or to live in a place, we get a third singular future form wat, sya, ti. Now, what you just heard may seem like a whole lot of little formal details to remember, so let's sum up what the future tense entails. First of all, its meaning is just like that of the future tense in English, so I will go, he will see, she will run, and so on. Its forms consist of a verbal root in guna, the future suffix sya or ishya, and the primary endings that we already know from the present tense. And so that actually means that, unlike in the present tense, there are no 10 different formations, no 10 different verb classes, but there's just the one way of forming the future that is the same regardless of what present tense stem a verb forms. The main difficulty involved in the future tense is that you get a lot of internal sandhi before sya, but if you grossly simplify what you find, before s, many sounds change into k, and after that k, the s in sya changes into shya. If you remember that, you should do rather well and should not have too much trouble recognizing future forms. And so on to the second new thing in this chapter, the middle and passive voices. Now, voice is here used in the same technical grammatical sense that was also introduced in chapter 3 of the book. English and Sanskrit both have an active and a passive voice. Active forms mean things such as she sees, you love, he addresses his friend, and so on, whereas in passive verbs you would find meanings such as she is seen, you are loved, he is addressed by his friend, and so on. So active verbs talk about doing something, whereas passive verbs talk about having something done to you or experiencing something. Sanskrit, in addition to active and passive, also has what we call a middle voice, and in English grammatical terminology, the term middle was chosen because originally the middle voice had a meaning that was in the middle of active and passive. And that meaning originally was doing something that affects yourself. So an action that you actively do, but that you also passively experience, such as she sees herself, for example, in a mirror. This is an action where she is both the doer, active, and the one who has something done to her. She sees and she is seen, namely by herself. An action like that could originally have stood in the middle voice. Another example of a verb in the middle might be he feels, because when you think about it, the action of feeling is something that you do, but you are also at the same time the one who is experiencing this action of feeling. So in a way, feeling is something that you do, but that is at the same time done to you. That was once in classical Sanskrit, so what we're focusing on here. The middle has exactly the same meaning as the active. It is indistinguishable from the active in its use. What is different, however, is that the middle has endings that are formally different from the endings of the active. To look at an example of this rather abstract account, so there is a verb vadati, which we've already encountered, meaning he says, and vadati is a verb that has normal active forms, but then you will also encounter a verb bhashate, also meaning he says, basically no difference to the meaning of vadati, but this verb bhashate has middle forms. You can tell because the third singular ending isn't ti, but te. In its meaning, it's identical, it's indistinguishable from an active, but in its forms, it's different, it's middle. Some verbs you will see have active forms, some verbs have middle forms, and some verbs actually have both. So let's look at the middle forms. In the present tense, we actually have separate forms for all three voices, for active, middle, and passive. But in all the other tenses, the passive forms are identical to those of the middle. So what we're going to be doing is first of all looking at the forms of the middle, and then at the forms of the passive, the separate forms of the passive that we're going to need for the present tense. Middle forms then actually use the same stem, the same verbal stem as their active counterparts, but they have different endings. What you can see here is a table comparing the active and middle primary endings. That's the endings that we find used in the present and in the future tense. And the active endings should be familiar to you at this point. So we have mi, si, ti, wach, tach, tach, mach, ta, nti. And when you look over at the middle forms, you will notice two things. First of all, middle endings all end in e. That is one way in which you can recognize a middle verb form. It'll end in e. Secondly, you will see that there also are a number of formal similarities between active endings and their middle counterparts. So, for example, in the first dual, we have wach and first plural mach in the active, but in the middle we have wahe and mahe respectively. Use those similarities to remember these new middle endings more easily. Let's just briefly go through them one by one. In the singular, in the active, we have mi, si, ti, and in the middle we have e, se, te. Now, se and te are basically just like si and ti, but with the short i replaced by an e. On the basis of that, we might expect the first singular ending to be me, but no, that's not what it is. Instead, it is e. So, e, se, te. Then in the dual, as just mentioned, we have not wach, but wahe, so very similar. Then second and third dual, we again have forms that are very similar to each other, with the only difference being that the second dual form involves an aspirated t, whereas in that same place the third person dual form has an unaspirated t. So in the active we have tach and tach, whereas in the middle we have te and te. Now notice we have two different vowels in front of each of these dual forms, and the thing about those is that we have a, te and a, te in the second and third dual of athematic verbs. E, te and e, te are what we find in those forms in thematic verbs. Then on to the plural. In the active we have mach, ta and nti. In the middle we have mahe, dwe and nti. First and third person, mach and nti, and their counterparts mahe and nte, fairly easily recognizable, but the second person plural, dwe, is fairly different or completely different from ta, so that is a form that should be properly memorized. So mahe, dwe, nte. One final note, athematic verbs have basically the same endings as their thematic counterparts, but as was just mentioned, we have in the second and third dual a, te, and ate, whereas in thematic verbs we have e, te, and ete. And in the third plural, we have in thematic verbs, thematic middle verbs, the ending nte, but in athematic verbs we have ate. Remember this, especially because ate very much looks like a third-person singular form and therefore could easily confuse you. To see a couple of proper full middle forms, let's look at the present and future paradigms of bhash, to speak. Bhash is a verb whose forms appear in the middle. And so in the present, we have bhashe, bhashase, bhashate, bhashavahe, bhashete, bhashete, bhashamahe, bhashadwe, and bhashante. In the future, we have the same marker that we also found in the active verbs, and so we get bhashishye, bhashishyase, bhashishyate, bhashishyavahe, bhashishyete, bhashishyete, bhashishyamahe, bhashishyadwe, bhashishyante. Let's look at one more middle paradigm, this time of an athematic verb. Now, athematic verbs in the middle use almost the same endings as thematic verbs. Note there's small differences in second and third dual and third plural, but we'll come to these in a second. And in the middle, athematic verbs always use the weak stem. In the active, we have the strong stem in the singular and the weak stem in the dual and plural. In the middle, it's the weak stem throughout the paradigm in singular, dual, and plural. As an example, let's look at hu, which is class 3, meaning to pour or to sacrifice. Now, we've already seen this verb in the active, juhomi, juhoshi, juhoti, and so on, but it actually also has middle forms. And as we said, in the middle, you only find the weak stem, so that would be juhu, and to that you add your middle endings. Now, in front of the first singular ending e, which begins with or is a vowel, the u at the end of the weak stem juhu changes into its prevocalic form, which is w, so we get juhwe, then juhushe, notice internal sandhi from se to she due to ruki, then juhute, dual juhuwahe, second dual juhwate. Notice two things, once again, in front of an ending beginning with a vowel. Juhu turns into juhw, so the u changes into its semi-vowel counterpart w. And then instead of having ete, we have ate. Same things happening in the third dual, so we have juhwate with juhu changing into juhw. And instead of having ete, we have ate. So the dual is juhuwahe, juhwate, juhwate, then plural juhumahe, juhudwe, and then third plural juhwate. Notice again in front of an ending beginning with a vowel, the juhu changes into juhw, and as mentioned previously, in athematic verbs we don't have a third plural ending ante, but instead we have ate. Notice that this looks deceptively like a third singular form. Finally, one practical note concerning the middle. Now, all of its forms end in e, and through external sandhi, word final e changes into a before any other word that begins with a vowel, or more specifically any vowel other than short a. In front of short a, the e remains as an e, and the a drops out, but in front of any other vowel, the e changes into a. So, for example, bhashate, upavishati cha. Bhashate, he speaks, upavishati cha, and sits down. Through external sandhi changes into bhashata, upavishati cha. This does not go against any of the rules that we've seen so far. It's simply that this has been a rare occasion of external sandhi so far, so be prepared to recognize it. Now, finally, the passive. In the present tense, the passive is formally distinct from the middle, whereas in all other tenses, the passive is formally identical to the middle. So what we're here looking at are exclusively present passive forms. Now, in the present, the passive is formed by taking a verbal root in 0 grade, plus a passive marker, ja, or in the first dual and first plural, that's actually ja, plus the middle endings that we were introduced to just now. To compare an active and a passive form, let's look at this table here, of yuj, meaning to link, we get the active forms yunajmi, yunakshi, yunakti. Yuj is class 7, and so in the strong forms it adds na into the root, and in the weak forms it adds n. Now in the passive, it doesn't matter at all what verb class a root belongs to. There's just one way for all the different classes to form their passives, and that's by taking the 0 grade of the root, so yuj, adding your ya, and adding your endings. In the first singular, that then appears as ye, so we don't get an ah, but we get e, yujye. Then we get yujyase, yujyate, yujyawahe, yujyete, yujyete, yujyamahe, yujyadwe, yujyante. Notice that because the passive marker ends in a, all passive forms are thematic, and therefore they decline like they conjugate like the middles of thematic forms. So we have yujyete and yujyete in the dual instead of ate and ate that we saw in the athematic middles. And we have a third plural ante rather than ate, which is nice because ante is nicely recognizable as a third plural. Unfortunately, not even the passive is entirely straightforward though. There are a number of formal irregularities in verbal roots that end in a vowel, because this vowel may change before the ya that is added to mark a form as passive. So for example, if you have a verbal root that ends in long a, that a usually changes into e. So for example, of da, to give, we have diyate, is given. Verbs ending in short i or u lengthen that to long i and u respectively. So of ji, to conquer, we get jiyate, is conquered. And of shru, to hear or to listen, we get shruyate, is heard. Short vocalic can turn into ri. So for example, pr, to carry, gives us priyate, is carried. But if it is preceded by 2 consonants, this changes into r. So of smr, to remember, we get smaryate, is remembered. Finally, long r turns either into ear, or if it is preceded by a labial sound, it changes into ur. So for example, of tur, to cross, we get tiryate, is crossed. Basically, in a nutshell, if you do not recognize the verbal root in a passive verb, but you recognize that it's a passive form you're looking at because you see the ya and the middle ending, what you should do is try and see whether you are looking at a root that you know, but you simply know this root as ending in a different vowel. Finally, there's 2 more formal irregularities to note, which however should not give you any trouble in recognizing the passive forms in question. The first of these is that some verbs actually use the root in guna as the basis for the passive. Normally you would expect to find the root in 0 grade, plus ya plus middle endings. These use the root in guna, plus ya plus middle endings. So for example, of han, to kill, we get a passive hanyate, is killed, and of lab, to take, we get a passive labyate, is taken. You can recognize both of these as passives because of the ya plus middle ending. Then the passives of class 10 verbs and causatives are formed by taking the root in the grade in which it appears in the active, plus ya plus middle endings. So of bharati, he carries, we get a causative bharayati, he causes to carry. And so what we have here is the root appearing in vritti, bhar. We find that same root in that same grade in the passive, namely bhar in vritti, But in the passive, bhar is then followed by ya, the passive marker, and a middle ending. So for example, third singular te, bharyate, he is caused to carry. And finally, a note on the syntax of passive verb forms. As we already saw in chapter 8, the agent of a passive verb, that is, the one by whom the action is performed, stands in the instrumental case. So, for example, balach narena britach means the child, balach, was carried, britach, by the man, narena. The exact same thing applies for present tense passive forms, so balach narena briyate simply means the child is carried by the man. Now notice that finite passive forms outside the present tense are formally identical to their middle counterparts. So it's actually the syntax of the sentence that helps us determine whether a particular form that we see in a specific sentence is middle or is passive. Now, if you have a passive verb form, you expect to see an agent expressed in the instrumental case. Whereas if you have a middle form, which for all intents and purposes functions like an active form, you might expect a direct object of this verb form. And so, for example, if you have a sentence such as balach narena drakshyate, drakshyate is the future either middle or passive of drish, to see. If you see this drakshyate with an instrumental, it's probably a passive form, whereas if you see drakshyate together with an accusative, which may well be the direct object, then probably drakshyate is middle. And so balach narena drakshyate would mean the child will be seen by the man, narena, in the instrumental, whereas balach naram drakshyate probably means the child will see, not a passive but a middle form, the man. That was it for this chapter. We hope that you found this video helpful, and if you have any comments or suggestions, we would love to hear from you. Please do write to us at rupal@cambridge-sanskrit.org. And now, for your own work on this material, good luck and have fun!